Welcome, those joining us. A very special welcome to panel members who I have the privilege of having a moderation role with today. I'll introduce you to them in a little bit, but first I do want to just acknowledge each of you for joining. I want to take the time to acknowledge that the Centre celebrates the lands on which we join from today. We know this is a nation of many nations, and we pay our deep respects to ancestors, to elders, to custodians of country, of the dreaming and of the here and now. We recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, cultures and law have existed since time immemorial, and with being on the record for most, I guess, for over 65,000 years. I want to acknowledge too and pay my respects on all of your behalf to the way in elders teach and guide us with grace and with strength. I want to acknowledge that leadership as a result, and those who work tirelessly to address inequalities and for the improving of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander justice outcomes, acknowledging the urgency of it. I know that the Centre is committed to ensuring that the voices of those whose lives are affected by the decisions governments make should fundamentally inform those decisions. We know in the work that we do, we honour the lived and living expertise of all victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, harnessing all ages, cultures, abilities and backgrounds, and commit to substantially addressing the harm of child sexual abuse now and well into the future. We also recognise that there are children and young people today who are experiencing sexual abuse, and recommit and dedicate ourselves each day to doing all that we can to act to ensure that there is effective protection and care. So again, thanks for joining. A reminder that given the content, and some of us have had thousands of conversations about this content, but it could be the 1,001st conversation where enough's enough and you need to take time, or you need some support from some support services which exist for that very reason. So we have a slide up now just to let you know what those support services are, to take note, and we'll remind you again at the end as well. Please look after you. Should you need to turn off and visit the conversation later, we encourage that. Yeah, it's whatever makes you feel your most strong and resourceful self in this moment, in the moments to follow. All right. So the people you've come to hear from, I know I've come to hear from them as well, and I've recently had the pleasure of meeting them after reading about their work in many spaces and places. I want to first introduce you to Professor Kylie Cripps, who is a Palawa woman and director of Monash's Indigenous Studies Centre. She's one of Australia's leading researchers on Indigenous family violence, but sexual assault and child abuse as well. She leads major grants and has contributed to the field through empirical studies that have defined violence on Indigenous terms and identified factors contributing to violence, and examined the access and availability of services in the aftermath of violence. Professor Cripps, thank you. Welcome. The second panellist is Tess Moody, and Tess is a proud queer, non-binary First Nations Palawa person. She is co-founding director of the National Peak Organisation for Victim Survivors in Australia, known as the Independent Collective of Survivors, and expert advisor and member of multiple Tasmanian and national advisory including the First Nations National Plan Advisory Group. Tess is a victim survivor of multiple forms of family and sexual violence across their lifespan, including child sexual abuse, and is passionate about empowering people with lived experience to bring systemic change in the prevention of family, sexual and systemic violence. Thanks for being here, Tess. And Professor Michael Salter is our third panellist. He's the Director of ChildLife, a research hub dedicated to the study and prevention of child sexual abuse and exploitation, based in the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales. Michael is an internationally recognised expert in child sexual exploitation, gender-based violence and complex trauma. He's the chair of the Grace Tame Foundation and an advisor to the Australian E-Safety Commissioner. Thank you, Michael. And a pleasure to introduce the fourth panellist. Dr. Morag McSween has more than 30 years experience as a community services practitioner, leader and researcher in Australia and the UK. Morag has worked in child protection, domestic, family and sexual violence fields as a counsellor, group facilitator and community educator, and was chair of the London Rape Crisis Centre Board. Morag is a member of the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Recovery Alliance and the author of Do You See Me? Do You Hear Me? Thank you to all panellists for joining me. Now, we've got a few questions to guide our yarns, and we note that we could be here all day if we were allowed to. And if we didn't have all those other busy roles we had to contribute to. So it's quite a feat, but I guess I want to start from your experience first. You know, that's why you're here. What do we need to understand about the relationship, or as some call it, the intersection between child sexual abuse and family violence? Michael, I might throw to you first because I understand you've got some research that you've been working on.
No worries, Fee. Really great to be here. We've been lucky enough to get some funding from the National Centre for a study looking at the intersection of domestic violence and child sexual abuse. Part of that is a systematic literature review. So we'll be putting up a fact sheet on the lit review this week, but we found 20 studies, so it's not a well-researched area looking at the co-occurrence. So it's well known, for example, that people who experience sexual abuse in childhood are more likely to report as adults that they experience domestic violence, for instance. So we have this intersection over the timeline, and this is often how intergenerational trauma shows up. In the systematic lit review, we looked at co-occurrence. So we looked at circumstances where kids were either experienced sexual abuse or exposed to domestic violence. And what we found was that for kids who report exposure to family and domestic violence in childhood, up to 20% of them reported co-occurring child sexual abuse. But for children or adults who reported that they'd been sexually abused when they were kids, up to 80%, and there's significant variance in the studies, but between 30 to 80% reported not only child sexual abuse, but they also reported co-occurring domestic, family and sexual violence. So it really paints a picture of just the burden of trauma that some kids are living under, but also that domestic violence, there's some indicators, if someone's experienced domestic violence, they're at heightened risk of also experiencing child sexual abuse. For people who've experienced sexual abuse in the home, it's highly indicative of domestic violence co-occurring. It doesn't mean it has for everyone, of course, but it's a significant risk factor and probably one that we haven't grappled with very well in the response system, which tends to treat sexual abuse over here and domestic and family violence over here.
Thanks for that. Tess, from your experience, what do you believe people need to understand about the intersection?
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm excited to be here. Before I speak, I just want to acknowledge any other victim survivors that might be in the room today. and really acknowledging that there are a lot of us that work in the sector. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. From my own experience, and it's probably on the back of what Michael's just said about, you know, we can compartmentalise child sexual abuse over here and family violence over here. So for instance, in my experience, I'm a, sorry, I've been eating crackers before I came in. I'm a victim survivor of child sexual abuse. Also a victim survivor of family violence in my childhood, but also in my adulthood, and a victim survivor of multiple forms of sexual assault in my adulthood. So backing up what Michael said, that, you know, often across a lifespan, we can be victim survivors of multiple forms of sexual violence or family violence. But something that I think we need to understand is how child sexual abuse can be an evolution into family violence. That sounds like a big statement, but for instance, in my experience, and my experience is not unique, I grew up in government housing, in poverty, and this is a common experience, not just to low socioeconomic families, but for me, I was groomed into child sexual abuse at the age of 13, which ended up being an 8-year relationship until I was almost 21. So for me, what started out as child sexual abuse and grooming and everything that was, which commenced at a time that I was experiencing family violence in my home as a child, that evolved into an adult relationship. So I was an adult by the time that relationship ended, which then culminated in what we would label family violence in an adult relationship. So this sometimes doesn't just exist compartmentalized. It can evolve across the lifespan. And it took me many, many years of labeling that I had been in a family violence relationship, many years for me to work out in therapy and getting my own understanding of what that was, to actually be able to label that child sexual abuse that then went across my lifespan. So I think the importance of needing to understand that is the way services respond to that experience, which can unpack a little bit more when we come to the question about service responses. So yeah, I'll hand to someone else.
Thanks, Tess. No worries. Well, I might go on to, you mentioned language, how important it is to be able to name it and identify it and understand it. What do you think are some of the current challenges related to how we respond to and support victims of family violence and child sexual abuse? Morag, I might go to you this time. Oh, you're on mute. You still on mute? Oh, hang on. Oh, Morag, you're still on mute. I'm not sure why. There we go. Try that.
Hi.
There we
Sorry
go.
about that.
You're right.
Sorry about that, everybody. Building on what Michael and Tess have both said, I think what I've been reflecting on since I kind of was asked to come on the panel is knowing and not knowing. So I think we, certainly researchers in domestic violence and child sexual abuse have known about the co-occurrence of child sexual abuse and family violence for many years. But I think that knowledge has been held in pockets and it hasn't been widely known. And I so relate to what Tess says about the importance of things being in the public discourse and labelled and known in order for victim survivors to be able to frame our experience, and also in order for service providers to be able to frame what they're looking for and frame their expectations. So I think that's incredibly important, and it's just amazingly wonderful that 1,000 people have turned up to listen to this today. So I do think that's incredibly important. The other thing I think has really struck me is the compounding impacts. So the compounding impacts of trauma from different sources will not be experienced as separate and siloed by victim survivors. But there's also compounding silences. So it's my view, and I'm sure others will share it, that in 2024 we are still more likely to subscribe to myths and inaccuracies about child sexual abuse and about family violence than we are to be able to face the truth about both of those things with open eyes. So I think the compounding secrecy, shame, and silence around both of those things sits alongside the compounding trauma.
Thanks, Morag. Kylie, what else do we need to understand about responses to support?
Yeah, I think I support Morag's points there. I think when we think about these issues, it is thinking about how we hear and listen to victims, but particularly children, because often children are seen and not heard, right? Adults are charged with the responsibility of hearing, but they don't actually hear in the way that our children need them to hear in these critical moments when they've been victims of this type of violence. And it's particularly challenging too when we're thinking about communities where there's intergenerational trauma and where that's unresolved grief. And so I think it's really important for us to unpack what is hearing. How do we actively listen to the stories that our children are talking about and that our families and communities are talking about so that we can walk this path together? I think it's also important for us to appreciate the stereotypes that, as Morag's talked about, because each of our communities are going to have different stereotypes that challenge the way in which we engage with these issues. And that also needs specific and targeted work for us to work through. But the other point that I'd make is that in terms of service delivery, for the Indigenous community in particular, we have very limited services that are dealing with sexual assault for children, but also particularly for families to walk it together. And I think, we need services that are culturally informed and trauma informed, and that they need to be working that together. If we don't have that, then we're not supporting a family to walk together. This isn't a journey that a child does on their own. Their mum's got to walk beside them. Their non-offending family needs to walk beside them. And so we need to be supporting the whole family, but particularly the child to do that.
Yeah, thank you. So we talked about the language a bit and the stigma and the stereotyping. So what are these barriers? What makes say we are effective and successful at ensuring there are more disclosures happening and more supports being accessed. Where do we go from there when it comes to perpetration and the ongoing support for the family post engagement with services and with the justice system?
Big question, Fee, and I think it really depends on the family dynamics.
Yeah.
If and when the allegation of child sexual abuse comes up, is there a supportive and protective adult? So, for example, does mum respond protectively to the child? Or does mum collude with the offender, which is not uncommon in domestic violence, because if she doesn't support the offender, then she and the kids risk physical retaliation or more from him. So there's a question, is there a protective response? If there's not, are services able to walk with mum or create sort of a reflective space for mum to come to terms with the allegation, as well as kind of the burden of family domestic violence, which often she's been been carrying. So I think that's a big sort of question here.
Mm.
It's also the case that for women who do respond protectively, they have a very rocky road ahead of them in terms of leaving the relationship, particularly once, if and when they become involved in family law and family court matters. Child sexual abuse allegations, it's typical that there is no evidence. That's the normal situation. There's no evidence beyond what the child has said. Often the child's made a disclosure to mum, but the child, especially if the child's quite young, it's very difficult for the child to kind of reach a kind of forensic threshold for child protection or law enforcement to say it's a substantiated allegation, at which point mum's really exposed in the family court system. So I think it's an area where we really need to better articulate practice frameworks and kind of decision-making trees for practitioners. This is very thorny. And I think also there are times where the best interests of the child may not always be in alignment, for example, with the best interests of mum. So yeah, I think we need to kind of do a much better job of just articulating the practice challenges and acknowledging just the context in which the people in this scenario are just trying to live and cope. Because I mean, Kylie's raised that broader question of intergenerational trauma, and that's very typical in this scenario, that mum's got her own trauma history, for example. I do want to just return to Tessa's point, because I think one of the challenges that we have in child sexual abuse is often, I think we've done a better job with family domestic violence to talk about it as like a pattern of behavior and a pattern of control. And we need to see that shift in child sexual abuse. I've done work for over 10 years with particularly women who were sexually abused as kids, and the sexual abuse continues into adulthood. But that is such a challenge to get any space for anyone to just hold the reality of that. One of the reasons why it's really difficult to make progress in child sexual abuse is these are the scenarios that just make people really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
They'll just prefer not to talk about them.
A huge barrier that just in itself, isn't it?
I guess
sorry, Mary.
If I could come in, kind of my reflections on that are I did a piece of work with a colleague for a children's domestic violence counselling service in Western Australia, and we looked at some of those really thorny issues. And one of them was, is it safe for the child to come to counselling? And what were the orders that were in place? What's the contact with usually the father, who was usually the perpetrator? Is there sexual abuse, acknowledged sexual abuse going on? Can that be managed within the service, or would it be better for the child to go to a specialist child sexual assault service? And on some occasions we concluded, much to the dismay of the practitioners, it wasn't safe for the child to be in counselling. And that what was a safer thing to do was for us to do, the practitioners to do an intervention with the mother. So exactly, they wanted to be with the child, they wanted to support the child, but it was not a safe thing to do, and it was safer to work with a mother. There's a really interesting dyadic work with mothers and children is probably the best evidenced intervention in domestic violence therapy. But one of the pieces of evidence there is that children progress much faster than their mothers. So children can actually acknowledge and process stuff that's going on while their mothers are sitting in shame and denial. So there's that different pacing thing. And then, of course, the other thing is, you said, Michael, is the family court. And if you go to the family court, child sexual abuse will be weaponized and turned into parental alienation. And it's just tragically common for children to be sent on contacts to fathers who are sexually abusing them. So yeah, incredibly complex and full of issues that we want to turn away from.
Right.
Can I add in there too? I think, it is important for us to recognise the family law court, but for many Indigenous families, we wouldn't even get to the family law court.
Yeah.
Many of our kids would be trapped in the child protection system before that. And so it is that conversation around how we provide support to mums, because in many respects, mums would be seen as failing to protect,
Yeah.
and the kids would be removed. And so it would be that cycle then of thinking through what kind of supports are we going to provide mum, to enable there to be a restoration for her to get her children back in a safe way. And that in particular, and particularly in a time-bound child protection system, we have a very limited window to get housing when there is time restriction on housing. So if they don't have housing within 2 years, if they haven't got met all the conditions that child protection put on them within 2 years, those kids will never come back. So in these kind of situations, for Aboriginal women in particular, the issue is very much around how do we put supports in place to prevent, if we possibly can, a removal in these kind of circumstances if mum is being protective.
Thank you. I want to ask about the child at risk or experiencing sexual abuse. How are they identified and prioritised within the context of family violence policy and service responses?
Can I go with that one?
Yeah, please.
Such a good question, because, I've heard from victim survivors who are children and young people. I've worked with them in my work with victim survivors. And they tell me repeatedly that they feel like when they speak up, that they don't have their own agency or even taken seriously. They're still, and infantilized as a little child who can't speak to their own experience. So I think that is something that needs to be thought about. And I know also in my work with victim survivors, nationally, there's been a real hesitancy to work with young people who are victim survivors to inform policy, service delivery, changes in law, like just across the spectrum. So I think what we need to do in the prevention and in the response is for organisations to get more comfortable with engaging with young people to hear what they need, rather than relying on the parents to say, this is what the children need, this is what the young people need, because that's the dominating voice when it comes to thinking about minors and their own agency. So I think that that's a really big gap. I do say that with a little bit of trepidation, because I know that there has to be a lot of organisational readiness and preparation to be able to work with young people who are victim survivors. There is knowledge and ways of working that's translatable from working with adult victim survivors to inform change. But then the work with young people is unique in so many ways due to the level of risk, psychological safety, everything we need to consider if we're going to capture what they need.
Yeah. Michael, were you going to add?
Yeah, what came to mind, it's a little bit flipping on its head a little bit, but we interviewed about 15 women who realised that their male partner was a sex offender. And what we found is that although a significant group of those women were experiencing family and domestic violence, they typically didn't know it at the time, so they wouldn't have labelled it as family violence. Even at the point at which police got involved, sometimes the men had abused their kids, abused other kids, abused kids online, all three. But she didn't know that it was family and domestic violence until some time afterwards. But for none of those women, no charges were ever laid for family and domestic violence either. And there was a lot of stigma, there was a lot of shame for those women about the fact that their partner was a sex offender, and there was also understandable suspicion, and it's difficult for law enforcement, but they didn't know at the time of investigation whether she knew or was colluding in the abuse. And that does happen in child sexual abuse, that mothers are active or they're collusive. So incredibly traumatic scenario. But often, I mean, we found these women actually just fell through the cracks of the response system. It could take them years to say that they were a domestic violence victim. They were leaving the relationship. There was often simultaneous child protection, family law, and criminal justice processes occurring at the same time. And they were often unable to access any support services around that. And they really were just operating in a vacuum and trying to parent their kid, who, even if dad's an abuser, the kid loves their dad, and all of a sudden he's gone. So it was just an interesting example for us of the way in which domestic violence and child sexual abuse intersects to produce like really unnecessarily poor outcomes. And women talk to us about their kids becoming incontinent overnight. Massive educational and developmental delays as a result of this process, which could take a couple of years. And in order to hold those families, really all that was needed was a bit more flexibility in the service response. But then sometimes there was total restrictions put on women in terms of what they could access because there was a criminal justice investigation, or because of the demands that were put on them by the family courts, for instance. So it was such an illustration of how people, through no fault of their own, can get really, really entangled. And of course, for those women at the same time, they were often dealing with their own reactivated trauma, because it really felt to us as researchers, a lot of those women had been targeted by the offenders because they had some pre-existing vulnerabilities.
Yeah. Really good points there. More.
If I could make a couple of comments there, and I think you're completely right. Predators target prey. They know what to look for. Absolutely right. And I think it goes to what Tess and I were both saying earlier about the importance of labeling being available in the public sphere, so that people have got words and concepts to make sense of their experience. But my kind of honest answer, Faye, to your earlier question is, to what extent are children who experience child sexual abuse identified and prioritised in the family violence service sector? I would say not. I would say that Marianne Hester's concept of the 3 planets, there are spinning planets of academia, service provision, and law that are entirely separate. And I think, generally speaking, not recognised. And if we add into that, I don't know whether this is changing, but the average age of disclosure of child sexual abuse is 52. So a huge amount of what's going on for children is not seen and is not acknowledged. So, I think conversations like this today are just so incredibly important to reinforce it happens a lot, and it happens together, so that we can, it's a truism to say that we see what we look for. If we know what to look for, we're more likely to see it.
Yeah. Thanks, Morag. And look, when you say people, it's the workforces need to have that understanding.
Absolutely.
Don't they?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And when you talk about flexibility and the service offerings and meeting the family where they're at, the mum, the children, very important that people have the skills, the competencies to
the core thing for me there would be, is kind of from my supervision work. I'm doing a piece of work with homeless accommodation on suicide and self-harm, and we're distinguishing what should young people be able to expect from any worker, regardless of their level of experience, and what should young people be able to expect from their key worker or a specialist worker. And those two things are different. I think we want to be clear about what we want any worker in the service sector to be able to hear and respond to, while still recognizing that there will be specialist interventions that are in and within and out with individual scopes of practice.
Yeah, great. So a question that we devised earlier together was about taking that more integrated approach to protecting and responding to children who experience child sexual abuse and family violence. Have you seen it anywhere? Is it happening anywhere? What are the elements there and the factors, if it is, and if you have?
I mean, we have one child advocacy centre in the entire country, which is in Perth. It's philanthropically funded. It doesn't receive state or national government funding. The intention of the CAC, which is Parkerville, is to provide a comprehensive wraparound support that integrates child protection and law enforcement, including specialist law enforcement who understand how to work with kids. You know, ideally there'd be, you know, forensic services on site, although again, that's a budgeting issue. And they have a family violence worker co-located because of it's so frequent that domestic and family violence is showing up when they're doing an investigation of child sexual abuse. But I think the fact that we have one child advocacy centre, the fact that it's philanthropically funded, speaks to the broader point that's been raised up by the other panellists, which is this is not an aspect of the service sector that has been prioritised. It hasn't been funded. There are long wait lists for clinical care for kids who have been sexually assaulted. You know, kids don't vote, they don't pay tax, they tend not to form political parties or social movements to advocate for themselves, especially sexually abused kids, because they're just trying to cope with life. And they're very easy to sweep under the rug. And this country has a long history of doing exactly that. And so, you know, without advocates, without the National Centre of Action, without partnerships with the women's sector, who, to be clear, carries a lot of the burden of this work, typically unfunded, you know, kids are going to continue to be neglected. But it's the reason why we face these challenges. It's partly a resourcing issue. I think the models of practice are out there, but why aren't state and territory governments putting their money where their mouth is?
Kylie.
Yeah, I would also say that similar to Michael, that the call for integrated services in this space has been long-standing. If we were to look at the Gordon inquiry from Western Australia, you know, the imagery on the Gordon inquiry was specific that you needed to have an integrated service. You needed to work with each party and then bring them together. And that was the same with Little Children Are Sacred. The imagery on that also talked about the need to have integrated services. The problem is that people haven't, you know, got behind that because it requires an effort that they're not funded to do. Right. And I think that that's the importance, because at the end of the day, to get integration to be effective, people have to sit around a table and work together. When I've seen integration work, it has been in sovereign nations, internationally, where people have been turning up on a Monday morning to talk about what's happened over the weekend with families. And I can remember naively as a young PhD student saying, how do you get everybody here on a Monday morning to talk through with these issues with families? Is it the food? Is it the coffee? And the response of the sovereign nation was to say, no, actually, the food's a good part of it. But the other part is that it's our family, it's our community. We are committed to seeing them through the set of circumstances that they're facing. And we will turn up every week to work them through this. And I think that that's the importance, because when we try to do this in a non-Indigenous setting, not everybody turns up because they don't have the same commitment as they would if this was their family member that they were walking beside to get them through these set of circumstances. So I think we really need to think about how we're going to get committed in terms of integration, because to be effective in this space, you need to work with each member of the family, including the child, so that people can get to a place where we can work it together. And we're just not doing that. We just have not got to that place. We keep on saying we will, and that's what we want. We keep on recommending that in inquiry after inquiry, but we haven't put the resources or the effort in.
One of the core things I take from that is so true of my experience in government, Kylie. I just cannot tell you how true it is. The amount of coordinating interagency, blah de blah, high needs kids risk panels that I have sat on in my lifetime, unbelievable. There was actually one initiative in New South Wales where the legislation was changed to allow agencies to pool funds. So where different agencies were in contact with a family, they could pool their funds in order to make a collective decision about how best to respond to the whole family and across the issues. Would you like to guess how often that happened in the 2-year period? Yep, you're not wrong. You are not wrong. So the thing that you say about in sovereign nation, it's us. In non-Indigenous bureaucracy, it's not. It's us and them. And that's the critical. We need to be taking seriously the vested interests for family law to do the family law thing, child protection to do the child protection thing. It's a big deal.
Yeah. You're answering another question we devised as well, and it's just how the community and wider respond to the integrating approach, and it is us taking the lead, not waiting, I guess, which happens in a number of the nations across this big nation. Look, I have a couple of questions here that have been sent to us in the chat. Somebody's asked about how information is shared across the system. Why can't I get it up anymore? Give me a second. Does information sharing and legislation currently happen between child protection, police, and other support for victims and survivors, or is reform needed there?
I feel like I'm speaking a lot, but I was around when the Royal Commission in New South Wales recommended changes to the legislation, so it was precisely so. It could be freed up that information could be shared where it was in the best interest of the child to do so. And I believe that the Royal Commission recommended that became an Australia-wide. I don't know if other panelists know that it's at the level of recommendation. Again, recommendation and practice are very different kettles of fish. And, we love our secrecy and we love our privacy and we love our own information. But my understanding is that it's a recognised priority across Australia. So I don't know if other panelists can correct me or let us know.
I mean, I think in terms of, background checks, blue checks for working with kids, those sorts of things, certainly we see dropouts depending on, the availability of data between states and territories. I think information sharing is important, but I really just point around kind of practice frameworks and the culture of collaboration. I mean, Kylie's really emphasized that. How do we, I suppose, develop a shared sense of mission around really complex areas of work? Child sexual abuse takes many complicated forms. It makes people really uncomfortable. It's why I think our public discourse of child sexual abuse is so attenuated and doesn't really address a lot of the diverse experiences of child sexual abuse that take place in this country. And as Morag said, you don't see what you can't name. And we are talking about an intersection that we don't name in policy and practice. And so I think information sharing is really critical, but what is it? Who's got the information? What are they doing with it? And ultimately, whose interests are we acting in? And that's not always an easy question to answer. Are we acting in the best interest of the child? Are we acting in the best interest of the woman? Are we acting in the best interest of the family? Are we acting in the best interest of the community? And, you know, that's not always an easy thing to square off, I think.
I agree with Michael and Morag. When we look at domestic and family violence and think, I mean, I remember a conversation I had with a domestic and family violence service many years ago, where a new risk assessment framework had come in, and they were frustrated that it wasn't actually capturing the detail of the work that they were doing. That they were working from the premise that they worked with every member of the family, kids, elders, whoever lived in the household, they were working with. But the problem with the risk assessment was that it assumed that it was a nuclear family, that you were just working with mum and dad, and not necessarily the kids. You might list the kids, but you're not really working with the kids. And so I think it's a really important thing around thinking about risk assessment in these situations and in family violence more broadly, to be thinking through what does a risk assessment look like when we're looking at this co-occurrence? What does it look like from mum's perspective, but also what does it look like from a child's perspective, right? Because in many respects, how mum sees it and how a child sees it is going to be different. Tessie, you'll probably be able to talk to this better than I can, but I think it is important for us to actually reflect on how we hear people's stories in these circumstances. How are they managing risk in these environments, and how do we then respond in a way that's supportive of their set of circumstances? Because if we're not hearing, if we're not asking the right questions, then we're not seeing it. And so I think that starts with the tools that we're being handed to utilize in our services. And certainly, when I worked with that organization, I was like, okay, let's do an intake. What do you want to ask? And then I was asking, so what are you going to ask about the kids? Have you told the mum that you're going to have to do a mandatory report if the kids have been harmed? And that wasn't even on the form. But it's also those questions too around, does Auntie live in the house? What has Auntie been exposed to? And talking about those questions of elder abuse, because we don't talk about that either. So it's these kinds of conversations around what's happening in a household and who's in a household and the exposures that are happening in a household that are fundamental to how we address the problems that we're faced with. And we're just not having those conversations.
Yeah, and look, speaking of conversations, people in the Q&A have noted the average age of 52 to disclose, and then how empowering it can feel when you hear from a victim survivor who states openly that they are. And I just wondered, well, on behalf of people asking questions, if a friend or colleague discloses, what's the best way to respond to them? Tess, and then maybe Morag.
Thank you. Obviously, everybody knows this one. Believe them when they're telling you. But I also want to talk about how when somebody does disclose to somebody else, I think something that we don't realise a lot or think about a lot is that the person that they're disclosing to, there's a chance they may also be a victim survivor of child sexual abuse. So I think sometimes, there's a big expectation on community to respond to when someone discloses without understanding they may be holding that same experience. So they may not be able to respond in a way that's expected at that point in time as well. If I was to say to someone, what's the top 3 things you should know if somebody discloses to you? Don't feel like you have to fix it. Don't feel like you have to tell that person what they need to go and do, because I think as humans we can go to quite practical responses around, oh, do we need to do this to, in response to that? Also, something that I warn people to not use as their first response is, have you reported it to the police, or are you going to report that to the police? For instance, in my Aboriginal community, that question is loaded, given the high criminalisation rates of our mob, high incarceration rates. If you're also a victim survivor of family violence, you may have witnessed and observed failures in policing when the family violence is being reported, and then yourself as a child or young person experiencing child sexual abuse, that won't feel safe. So don't always default to the have you reported to police. Just take a breath and say to someone, what do you need now that you've told me that, would be my advice.
Great, Tess. Thank you.
I would have literally nothing to add to that. That's perfect. What I would say is I've been doing a lot of work with therapists and looking at the concept of stewardship. So when someone discloses or someone talks to you about any kind of trauma that they have experienced, what you want to be is a steward of a safe space, for that to be a safe space for them. In order to do that, we need to steward our own capacity to be fully present. So I guess that's what I have been really focusing on in the kind of therapeutic support work that I've been doing, is about in order to steward the space, you need to steward yourself.
Great advice, and a big takeaway for us in this last remaining minutes. And gosh, how quick an hour goes. I just wondered if Kylie, Michael, Tess, if you had other takeaways for people at this point in closing.
I've got one that I can add on to mine around the responses. This might even sound like a bit of a devil's advocate, but I'm going to say it from my experience as an Aboriginal person, that the healing and the response and the support that someone might need may not be a therapeutic response. I know many victim survivors of child sexual abuse and family violence who have never reached out for counselling, never reached out for psychology. They've found their healing in talking to their families, their friends, their mob, going on country, lifting weights in the gym, all the other ways that you can think of that someone might need to be able to channel their trauma and their healing. So whilst, I think in our model of what we perceive to be support for child sexual abuse, we think, number one, around therapeutic interventions. But I think if we're going to think outside of the box, think about integrating supports, I think we need to really start looking at other holistic ways for victim survivors to be able to heal and recover and process.
Awesome.
I completely agree. And when people do seek therapeutic support, the therapist is walking with them for part of their journey. It's not the whole journey. The stats used to be that of women who'd experienced domestic violence, only 40% would reach out to services. I suspect that's much lower when you're talking about child sexual abuse, and lower still when you're talking about people who experience racism from services. So absolutely right. Therapy is fantastic, but it's absolutely not the only thing.
Michael, where can we get your fact sheet or access to that to the research you're talking about?
I'll get the centre to send it out. We're just finalising it today, and I just think in closing, I actually think, and I mentioned this earlier, but I think there's been a really useful shift in the family and domestic violence space to talk about coercive control, and to move away from an incident-based explanation of family and domestic violence to talk about the types of controlling relationships they take place in. I think that is a shift we haven't made yet in child sexual abuse. I think we're still really focused on, to be frank, the sexual incident that constitutes child sexual abuse, as opposed to the pattern of control and manipulation. I'm the chair of the Grace Home Foundation now, but what really struck me when Grace was initially talking, she started talking about grooming. She started talking about the relationship, that is the manipulative relationship that facilitates child sexual abuse. And I had multiple women in my life, women who'd been in the sector for decades, just in tears because they felt that they'd been responsible as kids. No one had ever explained grooming to them. So if we're able to situate child sexual abuse within the same patterns of manipulation and control and obsession and humiliation that I think we've done a good job of situating domestic and family violence in, I think that's also like a good kind of way to guide us through some of the practice challenges that we've talked about today. There really is a continuum of control and controlling relationships that sexual abuse takes place within, and so does family and domestic violence, and sometimes it's the same relationship.
Amazing. Thanks. Kylie?
All right, I'll keep it short. So mine is to hear our children's voices. I think it's really imperative that in this child sexual abuse space that we empower our kids to have a voice and to know that there's a safe person or a safe space that they can come to have their voice heard and acted upon in a way that they're going to be respected. And so it is to create those spaces and to actually hear our kids' voices. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do wish we had more time. Maybe we need a part 2. Can I just express my deep gratitude on behalf of everyone joining to you panel members. Such important conversation. And look, a recording's going to be available, so please don't stress if you came in late or if you weren't able to join. We encourage feedback on the session. We encourage you to access support services. Look, it is a normal reaction to be triggered or re-traumatized by some of the things we've spoken about. So please look after you as we finish up here. A big thank you again just to the National Centre staff and to the people who took the time out of the days, Professor Michael Salter, Tess Moody, Professor Kylie Cripps, and Dr. Morag Sween. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate your time and everything you've contributed.